The Kingsman series is one of the more interesting and unique franchises to come out of the past 10 years or so, in a time when Hollywood's becoming increasingly risk-averse, politicised and dependent on generic superhero flicks and tired remakes of old properties. It was pretty fucking nice to get a movie that was smart, funny, violent, original, irreverent and more concerned about delivering a good story than trying to push the message. It was a kind of satire on the James Bond movies about a working class kid who gets recruited into a top secret spy organisation known as the Kingsman and ultimately has to help them stop a deranged billionaire from wiping out most of the world's population. It was a decent little movie that played on the contrast between the down-to-earth protagonist and the stuffy upper class organisation he had to fit into, and it made a pretty valid point that a man's worth shouldn't be defined by his background and social standing. The Golden Circle was a slightly forgettable sequel that tried to walk back one of the key moments of the original movie and mostly came across as an inferior imitation rather than a genuine progression. So I have to admit, I wasn't quite sure what to think when director Matthew Vaughn announced that a prequel was in the works way back in 2018. Jesus, I can barely even remember that far back. Who am I kidding? I can barely remember what I did yesterday. Anyway, the film was delayed several times due to studio takeovers and of course the unspecified virus of unknown origin, before finally staggering out into movie theatres in December last year. Although fuck me, it must have come and gone like a fart in the wind because I can barely remember any advertising or even mention of it. But hey, as my psychopathic neighbour used to say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And so, last week I finally got around to watching The Kingsman, and the good news is that it's actually pretty good. I mean, it certainly won't bag any Oscars, and it doesn't quite measure up to the 2014 original, but overall it was a fun, engaging, irreverent, and surprisingly well-intentioned film that kept me reliably entertained for a couple of hours. So what the fuck? As Tatiana likes to say, drop your trousers and let's get started, shall we? The movie kicks off in the early 1900s during the Boer War in South Africa, where the Duke of Oxford is delivering Red Cross parcels to a prisoner of war camp, along with his wife Emily and his son Conrad. Oxford was once a soldier himself, but after a few kills too many, he's become a pacifist and a humanitarian. Nice one, old chap. Unfortunately, shit goes wrong when the camp comes under attack and Emily gets killed in the crossfire. Ah, I see you made the classic error of bringing your wife and kid unprotected into an active war zone. Anyway, flash forward 10 years or so and the big European powers of Britain, Germany and Russia are gearing up for a nice spot of war. Conrad's eager to sign up and do his part too, despite his father's objections, and so to keep him distracted, he accepts a diplomatic mission to Sarajevo to escort the Austrian Emperor Franz Ferdinand. And well, anyone who knows their history knows how that one turns out. The assassination of Ferdinand is the spark needed to light the fires of war, and pretty soon British, Russian and German armies are busy turning Europe into the world's biggest game of battle royale. Oxford suspects the assassination was more than just a random attack, and that there's something much bigger afoot here, so he taps into the network of covert spies that he's cultivated over the years to begin his own investigation. The trail eventually leads him and Conrad to Russia, where the mad monk Rasputin is persuading the Russian emperor to make peace with the Germans. Naturally, this would be bad news for the Western allies, as it would allow Germany to concentrate all their military strength against them. It turns out that all of this shit has been orchestrated by a mysterious man known only as the Shepherd, who's dedicated his life to triggering a global war that will bring down the British Empire. Why? Well, that's for Oxford and Conrad to find out. So the movie becomes a kind of race against time to foil the Shepherd's plans, save their country and end the war. But will they succeed? And what price will they have to pay to stop him? The Kingsman is kind of a difficult film to sum up because in some ways it plays out like two different stories sandwiched together into one movie. On the one hand, it delivers a solid old-fashioned adventure story that moves from one end of Europe to the other, hits all the expected beats and delivers all the payoffs you'd want. It kind of lulls you into a false sense of security, making you believe this is all just a fun, light-hearted adventure, only to pull the fucking rug out from under you around the halfway mark and go in a completely different direction. If I was to read a little deeper into all of this, I'd say it was almost trying to mirror the experience of Britain at the time and the millions of young men who eagerly signed up to the military on the promise of adventure and excitement, only to get fed into a giant industrial meat grinder of mud, blood and bullets. But hey, maybe I'm giving it a little bit too much credit. What did surprise me though is how well it manages to integrate its story into real historical events. I mean, don't get me wrong, the idea of a secret cabal manipulating important political figures across Europe to trigger the First World War is the stuff of pure fantasy. fantasy, and it definitely takes a few liberties with real characters like Mata Hari and Rasputin, but for the most part it actually gets the major historical events pretty much correct. And there's a lot of stuff referenced here that only actual history buffs would even appreciate or understand. The Zimmerman telegram, the death of Lord Kitchener, the murder of Rasputin, it's all here and it's all put into a historical context. And considering most people today barely even understand how or why World War I happened, it would have been easy enough to just bullshit their way through and make the whole thing up. So the fact they took the time to work all this stuff in just, well, makes me think they cared a lot more about this story than the bulk of Hollywood writers today. The other thing that surprised me was how refreshingly non-political this film actually is. Because let's be honest here, a movie about a group of posh white English gentlemen fighting to save the British Empire from a working class revolutionary, while accompanied by a black African servant and a female housekeeper, at a time when women weren't even allowed to vote and racial equality was something to be laughed at over brandy and cigars, could easily have turned into a fucking disaster in the hands of a different creative team. Oh, the lectures that could have been given and the virtues that could have been signalled. For the most part, the King's Man is content to leave those things alone and just concentrate on telling its own story. There's no real attempt to delve into the murky politics of British imperialism or portray the white male leads as bumbling buffoons that have to be constantly saved and belittled by a strong female character, or deconstruct the class system that was so dominant in British society at the time, which I'm sure must have infuriated all those professional activists, journalists, who expected yet another tiresome attempt to recontextualise historical events and people through a modern lens, but well, they can kindly get fucked as far as I'm concerned. Oxford doesn't spend half the movie apologising for who and what he is, because, well, he simply doesn't have to. He's well aware of how lucky he is, and he's matured and learned through past mistakes and experiences. Instead, he's portrayed as a decent, compassionate man, reluctantly forced to take up arms again to help others and protect his only son. Fucking Christ, imagine that! A strong, intelligent, honourable father figure in a modern Hollywood movie? Whatever next? Women who aren't capable of tossing around 200-pound henchmen like rag dolls? That being said, there's definitely a few shortcomings to the King's Man. As much as I like the fact that he's able to adapt his plans and overcome setbacks, overall, the Shepherd is a pretty weak antagonist. His motivations are about as superficial and simplistic as they come, and he's nowhere near as charismatic and memorable as Valentine from the first film. Keeping his identity hidden until the finale also puts some pretty heavy expectations on the big reveal, but when it actually happens, I was more like, eh? Then holy shit! The fight scenes are generally well done, and there's some great set pieces in the trenches of the Western Front that give you a flavour of how fucking awful that war must have been, but they never really match the inventiveness and energy of the first two Kingsman movies. And it's a shame because there's plenty of room to construct interesting fights that really make use of the environments and technology of the time, but oh well. The movie also drops little hints about Oxford being very much an older man now, which makes sense when Ralph Fiennes is pushing 60, but the script never really does much with it. It might have been interesting to show him struggling to keep up with the action, or faltering against younger and stronger enemies, having to use his wits and experience to make up for his physical shortcomings. An aging man from a different era, making his last defiant stand against a changing world. But nah, he's mostly just a standard action hero who's just as fast and strong and good at fighting as people half his age, so sure, okay, I guess. Djimon Hounsou is a great actor that's always entertaining, and honestly, I would have liked to have seen more of him in this film. He's got a kind of older brother relationship with Conrad that could have been explored in more depth, and he feels like a bit of a fifth wheel in the finale, which really reinforces my opinion that more thought could have been put into the set pieces. All of these gripes detract a little bit from what's otherwise a pretty enjoyable movie experience, but ultimately, that's all they really are, just minor flaws and shortcomings. They certainly didn't ruin the movie for me, and by the end, well, I felt pretty satisfied with what I'd seen. It's just a shame this film seems to have come out at a bad time, with almost no advertising push behind it. Just another victim of studio politics and shitty global events. Because honestly, I'd happily go on another adventure with the King's Man. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.